Okay, so we're focusing more on things that are kind of cartoony as opposed to our classic notion of what might be considered a good, realistic character expression. And for that, you kind of think about okay, you start off with this head that's got the solid, relatively unmoving portion. Drew this crosshairs on to indicate where the eyes are going to appear, right? And you got this other kind of muzzle or mandible area on the front of it. And that's your classic kind of Disney or Warner Brothers idea, WB, copyright. And then you have the notion of kind of more of a wild kind of expression, right? Like you can kind of draw to whatever the heck you want. And so this sort of expressive quality is going to be driven more by gesture. I always draw kind of in a Disney font whenever I write gesture, right? Or drawing. This is where your drawing takes over, and it becomes less about forms or even kind of classic shapes, right? These are clearly shapes, but they're driven more by this kind of intense internal quality of energy that's occurring. I'm going to go in and throw in some power lines, throw in some deeper, larger lines. You kind of develop a capacity to choose the thickness of line that you want based off of the expressive sort of mark making that you want to make. And to accentuate that even further, you might command minus zoom out, and I'm going to go ahead into my palette, lower my alpha. It's a little harder for me because I work a lot in Photoshop and then I'll switch back to this. But the idea is, you got this kind of overall internal energy of what's happening here. And this is sort of your thick-lined kind of expressive drawing that you might get the impulse to do every so now and again as an artist. Let's not let this good feeling end. Let's just kind of follow through with this the whole way. This could be a character who's kind of like, going like, hey, oh, howdy, right? Kind of a classic position like that. Or we could even kind of do, the classic, point, like, hey, what the heck do you think you're doing here, right? Kind of a thing. And of course, it all goes back to the full body expression. A lot of times with this sort of broad acting, this sort of broad acting requires kind of a strong, I'm going to switch this to a smaller pen, gesture. All right? Yeah. Right? Kind of a nice, strong gestural quality. I'm going to grab my lasso tool, that is L. Why'd that happen? No! I hate it when the darn computer acts against me. But again, that's just life, right? I'm going to put a X marks the spot to show where this character is reacting, right? So you might think that this is an expression of rage, but it doesn't have to be. Let's go ahead and go onto this layer here, go into my cleanup line. I'm going to use the semi-transparent again. But, someone could be incredulous, like, what the heck? Add in the eyebrows after the fact. Someone could kind of have like an incredulous expression when they're reacting to something. In that case, the hand probably wouldn't be as aggressive. It would be a little more kind of like, what? Right? Just, the emphasis is here, right? That might be the emphasis. Expression. And reaction. And our audience, of course, is reading all of this simultaneously. And that exists simultaneously with things that we discussed previously, like our, say in this case, I'll put the power center here in the pelvic area, which isn't that unusual. It's not just Quagmire from Family Guy who has that. And you can see by having the power center occurring right in the pelvis, it gives us something that reacts strongly, like Yosemite Sam, Tasmanian Devil. A lot of our classic characters do have a pelvic sort of power center. But, you know, like Taz, kind of his chest often is treated as the power center. When he reacts, the pelvic area tends to be primarily. And this is classic for a lot of Chuck Jones characters like Foghorn Leghorn, and even Daffy Duck. And Daffy Duck's probably the best known one. Where having that lower body pelvic center immediately gives us kind of a contrapposto, you know, that from your anatomy class, where you draw from the human figure, where the character is kind of reacting at the bottom. So while we deal with the front of the body, the face, this primary area, we can't neglect the fact that quite often the things that we deal with as animators are going to have more to do with this line of action that goes through the internal structure of our character. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit more. There's my zebra on my wife's clock from her grandfather. It's this great classic clock of wild animals. Let's kind of go back to the notion of that kind of overall expression that's loose. Characters' eyes, more often than not, are going to be used for wild expressions. So let me pick darker yellow for my baseline color. And, you know, eyes might kind of start off more like this, kind of classic cartoony eyes, as opposed to kind of more eyes that may feel a little more naturalistic. Not that you can't do this with these eyes, but, you know, taking these eyes to wild extremes, you're kind of asking for trouble, versus these eyes with the eyebrows kind of detached. And these more naturalistic ones, which we just don't expect to distort so massively. These eyes can easily go to something like this. And this expression is called a take. You can also call it an extremely distorted kind of expression. These often will waver. This is by Tex Avery, the famous animator known for things like the Red Hot Riding Hood or Field and Scream series. You may have a desire to do these sorts of expressions. Certainly when I was younger, that was where I went with my expressions. But these days, and you know, these conservative days we live in, eye positioning may benefit more from you taking, say, like these classic googly, you know, Jim Davis, or you know, that's that era of cartoon eyeballs, and maybe even taking the position of the eyes and the pupils and making them sort of neutral. And you could take these eyes and try a variety of expressions before you commit. So something like, you know, something like this will give you sad eyes. Something like this may give you suspicious or sleepy eyes. This may give you, you know, kind of wide-eyed shock. This may give you angry eyes. This is kind of more like Stuart Gilligan Griffin kind of expressions. But those do work. If you want to show extremely pissed off, you show the same eyes only with the lids brought up. And this gives you kind of the notion of if these lower eyelids have been brought up. Sorry, I keep on going to the wrong darn layer. But that's kind of the feeling of these cheek muscles being brought up and in. So let's just kind of repeat that quality. And the last thing you're going to maybe add, and I'm going to increase the thickness of my eyebrows, is the eyebrows themselves. See, they can vary a great deal in shape. And yeah, sometimes by just placing them in, it radically changes the expression. I will use these eyes if I know that the final character is going to be CG or is going to be a realistic character, these eyes are pretty good for quickly getting in expressions. I know that I can quickly change something like this, which is more cartoony, into something more realistic like this relatively quickly if need be. So I tend to kind of vary based off of my cartoon. My initial storyboard pass, it's entirely based off of my characters that I'm looking at, but consider these different types of eyes when you're working in the future.